Hey, welcome to the BJJ Mental Models Podcast, Episode 2. I'm Steve Kwan.
I'm Matt Kwan.
Thanks again for listening. This is our second episode. We've changed the audio dynamics a little bit. Hopefully the sound quality is a little bit better than before. Again, please bear with us. We are newbies at this. Quick recap of our previous episode for those of you who didn't listen to it. And I would encourage you to go back and do so because I think it was a good conversation about the topic of alignment in BJJ. A lot of what we talked about there is going to inform what we talk about today. But for those who have forgotten or maybe want a quick primer, we talked about Rob Bernanke's theory of alignment. And basically the idea, and again, Matt, correct me if I'm wrong on this, is that you can think of Jiu-Jitsu as a game of really three different principles that Rob collectively calls alignment. One of them is posture, meaning basically how effectively you are positioning and utilizing your spine. The second is structure, meaning the effectiveness of how you are positionally utilizing your limbs. And then the third is base, which is basically positioning your body in such a way that you can create and absorb force relative to your goals. So really, the way that you can think of jiu-jitsu is you've got these three factors and you want to keep those three at all times while simultaneously denying them to your opponents. And if you can do that, you can do jiu-jitsu.
That's 100% correct. I think that's very accurate. And please bear with us as we are playing with the audio, as my brother pointed out. And today we wanted to talk a little bit more about some concepts such as mechanisms, specifically frames and levers.
Yeah.
And, one thing that Professor Rob always talks to me is jiu-jitsu is not a game of moves, but a game of movement and also a game of levers. Okay, so knowing how to manipulate levers, levers are force multipliers. So if I want to control Steve's shoulder, if I control the end of Steve's arm of that shoulder and I utilize a proper wedging and fulcrum system, I should be able to have quite a bit of efficiency in terms of controlling that corner of his body. We're going to discuss some different ways that you can control levers and maybe some ways that you can improve some submissions. We're going to use an armbar for an example and just talk about some different mechanisms that we utilize in jiu-jitsu. When we speak about mechanisms, your main mechanisms are going to be lever and fulcrum, wedges, clamps, and hooks. And I don't know if I'm forgetting any of them.
Frames?
Frames, sorry. That's frames and levers, huge one. Thank you, Steve. Frames and levers specifically right now. Frames and levers are super important to talk about with new students because they give them the concept that, yes, a lever is a force multiplier and you can, obviously it introduces the engagement phase. We talked about phases of guard last time. But framing is a concept of that involves managing distance. And just like any combat sport, managing distance is a huge priority because if you lose the distance management and you're just going in there scrapping, you're going to find yourself falling behind the sequence. And when you fall deep behind the sequence in jiu-jitsu, generally your opponent has made things very uncomfortable for you and they've broken your alignment or they're on the way to further breaking your alignment, which is going to lead to catastrophic results for you.
Yeah, for me, the reason why I think this episode is super important is because if you want to give someone a conceptual framework for jiu-jitsu, the first thing you're probably going to talk to them about is something like the theory of alignment, which is very high level. You're really talking about just very, very, very big ideas at that point. And once someone understands what those are, the next question is, hey, that's all great, but how do I apply that? Okay, great, I understand posture, structure, base, but how does that help me armbar? These concepts are about mechanics, and this is the bridge between those high-level ideas and how you actually do things on the ground. So when we talk about alignment and how you gain proper alignment while taking it away from your opponent, these are the mechanisms that you use. And every single move you do in jiu-jitsu, whether it is a submission, a takedown, a sweep, or even just positional control, all comes down to using these mechanisms effectively. Now, the thing I like about the way that they're described here is I think everyone who's been training for a while kind of understands this stuff, at least at some subconscious level. But what Rob did really well was put together a framework of using names for these things. And coming up with names that people can understand and share is so important to helping memorize and really internalize these lessons. So maybe we can talk about these a little bit at first. I would suggest, Matt, that maybe what we can do is just go through each one of these and kind of explain what they are, and then maybe get into some examples and some troubleshooting as to where these things actually apply in real life sparring. Again, this is a podcast where we're not going to be breaking down moves on a step-by-step tutorial style basis like you see on YouTube. Really, we're talking about mental models and big ideas. But if you understand these, hopefully they will equate to improved learning when you actually start trying to individualize certain techniques. So let's talk about perhaps frames first. This is something that I think, regardless of what school you train at, you're going to have heard this term. Someone's going to have said, oh, you should frame, frame to do this, frame to do that. But usually it's not really explained what that actually means. So, Matt, how do you define a frame? What exactly would you say a frame is at the most basic state?
Essentially, like I said earlier, a frame is just going to be an obstruction or a blocking, usually using your limbs, utilizing your limb to create a block. I want to say the word frame, but that would be really bad for my description. But essentially, yes, it is just that. It is framing to create distance. And ideally, when you create frames, you're going to be able to manage distance. You could use, we're going to talk and use some language that Ryan Hall used, which is really great. Definitely check out Professor Ryan Hall, one of the first guys to conceptualize the teaching of Jiu-Jitsu. The way he breaks it down is there's different ranges. Okay, so you've got like long range frames, medium range frames, close range frames. Okay, and he uses the analogy of weaponry. So if I'm going to use a long range frame, for example, the sole of my foot. Okay, imagine I'm on my back in the open guard, and the sole of my foot is taking the weight of my opponent. That is going to be the equivalent to my sniper rifle, right? That is a long range frame. It is a powerful frame. I have the ability to do a leg press with it. Very important when you're playing open guards. Then, what if your opponent throws your leg to the side? Well, you're going to have your knees and your shins as frames as well. So that would be your mid-range frame. Or even, you could look at it as a short range frame. I usually think about short range frames as being with your arms, but think about your hands being frames as well, and your forearms being frames, or your elbows. So different range frames for different positions, and it's just important to understand that when you're playing guard, the goal, the thing that Rob taught me, it's not necessarily about going for submissions and sweeps, even though that's what it looks like you're doing when you're playing guard. You're looking for positions and sweeps and submissions, but more so just staying in alignment and managing your frame. So that could mean replacing frames. If your partner is passing your guard, how are you able to reincorporate your limbs into a structure that manages the distance effectively between you and your opponent? Once he instilled this idea into me about don't even worry about sweeps and submissions, just worry about managing the distance, I realized that I was able to focus a lot on my guard retention, and then organically these sweeps and submissions sort of they manifest themselves as I started thinking about bringing my opponent out of alignment while I maintain my own.
Got it. Now, when it comes to frames, I guess one of the things you really have to understand is that not all frames are good or strong frames. There's a difference between a frame that is effective and a frame that is a liability to you. I think an example I can give from personal experience is I remember when I was a blue belt, a guy was trying to pass my guard, and to frame, I basically did the, not really a bench press, but I did a straight arm, right? Like I stuck my arm out straight, I put my hand on his hip, and he hip switched, and which basically effectively wrist locked me because I left my hand out.
We've all done it.
We've all done it. And another similar example being, and I think everyone can relate, if you're playing open guard from the bottom, if you extend your legs and leave them there, they become a liability. Your opponent can grab them and use them to pass. So not all frames are good frames. I guess a follow-up question here would be what makes a frame good? Like if I'm putting together a frame, what are the things I want to do to make sure that it's strong and that I'm also protecting myself when I'm doing it?
Yeah, really great question. Like Steve was saying, imagine you're playing a spider guard or an open guard, and you have your grips, and you're extending your legs very strong, right? Now, against an opponent who's just putting weight on you, this is going to be an effective way to manage distance. However, if your opponent is moving around constantly, changing angles, and essentially controlling your frames, he is doing what we call turning a frame into a lever, okay? And this is very important to understand. If I'm on the bottom, I'm looking to manipulate my opponent's levers. And in doing so, I'm affecting sometimes their posture, their structure, and certainly their base, okay? So it's important to understand how to turn your opponent's frames into levers, and also how to deny your opponent the ability to turn your frames into levers. This is a huge breakthrough. For me, it was an amazing change in my game when I understood this. I also think about, you could grab your partner's leg, or you could manipulate your partner's leg to gain internal or external rotation, thus controlling the lever to their hip. Okay, so legs are the levers to the hip, and arms are the levers to the shoulder. So if you can get some sort of rotation upon your opponent's limbs, usually internal, I find, is internal rotation, like a kimura, is going to be one of the most effective ways you can control a person's shoulder. But back to frames and levers, making a frame a lever is going to give you a huge, it's going to make you change your partner's alignment very, very effectively. Yeah.
So I guess, an example that probably everyone has encountered is you have mount, and your opponent knows now that you're going to attack something, so they just kind of shell up. They bring their arms up and they tuck in their elbows, and it's like trying to wrestle a turtle all of a sudden. There's nothing for you to grab onto.
They're taking their ball and they're going home. Basically, That's what Rob calls it.
Yeah, and you can also do that from side control as well, where you kind of shell up, and it can be, if done properly, it can be an effective defense. You don't want to just sit there and do nothing, but when you shell up like that, you can start using your arms and your elbows for frames. And as the guy on the top, what you want to do is you don't want to let him do that. You want to turn those frames into levers.
That's
so
correct.
Instead of letting the guy, keep his elbows tucked in like that, you want to pry one of those elbows off, and you want to start establishing a degree of control on his arm. So that's what you're talking about when you say turn the frame into a lever, right? Don't just grab the guy because you can, but grab the guy and nullify his ability to use that limb as a frame, and make sure that you can actually use it to control him.
Yeah, exactly. And we should also mention, because right now we're speaking in frames in terms of limbs, but also your spine is a really strong frame. In fact, your spine is the strongest frame in your body. So, if your opponent is trying to do like a double unders pass, or maybe you've got a triangle on your opponent and they're trying to stack you, I struggled with this for years. I thought that I was no good at triangles because my legs are too short. Every time I go for a triangle, my opponent would either throw me to the side or they'd stack me. Why can't I get my legs into the position I want? And then I realized that once I get my hips up and apply my spine as a frame, I basically create a post throughout my spine, and that's going to make it very difficult for my partner to effectively stack me, because I put myself in posture and I used my spine to put myself in alignment. So once you use your spine and as a frame and gain posture, tons of opportunities open up. As we all know, most of the time when you're trying to do things in jiu-jitsu with just your extremities, it's not very effective. Mm-hmm. Using your core or using your spine as a frame and really engaging your torso is one of the best ways that you can actually make your jiu-jitsu effective and your wedges stronger.
Yeah, this is something I'd love to talk about in a future episode. I've always called it the anatomic hierarchy, which is basically that you've got different regions of your body that have different levels of strength. And a very, very common mistake, even at a high level, is to not realize that your core is the strongest part of your body. And with almost every move, you want to find a way to engage your core rather than just using your arms or your legs. I like the example you brought up about a triangle, because the interesting thing is that on the flip side, you've described using your frame from a triangle when you're the guy doing the triangle. But everyone who's trained for a little bit knows this. The plan A defense to a triangle is to keep your posture straight. And what you're doing then is basically you're using the guy who is defending is also using his spine as a frame because he's trying to prevent you from being broken down. And if anyone's ever tried to triangle a guy who has his back straight up, you know how hard that is. That's probably the main situation where you get stack passed from the triangle. So on one hand, you want to use your spine and raise your hips so that you have a solid frame when you're attacking the triangle. On the other hand, you want to find a way to make sure your opponent is not doing that because you need to prevent them from using their spine. And that's how you can effectively do a triangle on anybody, regardless of size.
Yeah, and of course, like we discussed last time, if you attack a triangle on somebody, apply a triangle on somebody who has full alignment, you're going to get your guard pass. Let's imagine that we do have our opponent in the triangle now, and their posture's broken. One thing that I used to have issues with, like I said, my legs felt so short when I would do triangle. There's a few things that I've discovered since then that have really made my triangle stronger. But in terms of the choking mechanics aspect of it, I realized that driving my hips up into my partner's neck was one of the best things that really amplified my choking pressure. So again, you can use frames like your spine for preventing guard passing or preventing submissions, but also finishing submissions. You're going to get a lot more horsepower if you harness the power of your hips. And also, like Steve was saying, when you're in the triangle, you want to posture up. That does not mean look up. That means thinking about the position of not only your neck and your spine, but also your hips. So generally, when your hips go in, when you're inside someone's closed guard, it creates a shelf or a wall that makes it very difficult to attack from.
Yeah. I mean, looking up is great and all, but if your spine is still crooked or it's not properly aligned, the other guy's just going to pull your head right back down again.
That's right. I like to think about driving my chest through the triangle if possible. And shelving their hips with my legs. And
what's interesting is when you're talking about like an arm bar, it's the exact same principle. You want to engage your core, you drive your core, you use your core as kind of the main horsepower when you're doing an arm bar. The arms and the legs help, but they're really just there to hold the guy in position while your core does most of the work. And this is a common thing in a lot of different submissions. Even in like cross chokes and guillotines, being able to properly engage your core gives a lot of strength. We can talk about that probably at another time, but for now, just tying into frames, we talked about levers briefly, and these are kind of in some cases you could describe these as the counterpoint to frames. How do you define a lever? What is an effective lever in jiu-jitsu?
A lever is just like, obviously, we were discussing that your extremities are levers, right? Your arms and your legs. Also, your head can be used as a lever. Essentially, the head is the lever to your spine. So if you want to control someone's body, you can utilize their head as a lever as well. But just realizing where the fulcrum is, depending on what you're trying to do, you can get tremendous effect by controlling a lever. So I like to use the example of a kimura. We're big on the kimura system at our school. And of course, Rob has great kimura concepts. It all focuses on control and using it as a system and a control system as opposed to a submission, because you can go so many different places with the kimura. So in terms of a kimura, having the end of the lever where you're pinning the end of the wrist, and then you have a 2-on-1, so the other arm is coming in and isolating the shoulder, you're creating kind of a two-pronged attack on the lever, which is going to give you tremendous rotational control.
Got it. So you're basically, you have the wrist as a point of torque, you have the shoulder as a point of torque, and the elbow is basically useless for the guy.
That's right. And there's different types of levers. Like if you want to look at an arm bar, now the actual work is being put into your opponent's elbow. When you're going to finish the arm bar, it's a linear submission instead of a rotational submission like a kimura. So with the arm fully extended, we're creating pressure on the shoulder joint, isolating with the proper wedging system with our legs. Obviously, we need to control the end of the lever with your hands or your elbow pit, whatever you like. And then your hips are extending into the elbow, into the proper direction that you want to finish the armbar. So there are different types of levers, and it's important to understand this. But looking at arms and legs is nothing more than levers, and levers to be accessed on your opponent. You're going to be able to be very efficient when you're trying to control parts of your opponent's body.
Yeah, I remember on the last episode you talked about this briefly, where you talked about how the limbs, especially the arms and the legs, they have multiple joints, and the pressure can flow and be released from one to the other. So if you don't properly secure all of the joints in someone's body right up to the shoulder or up to the hip joint, then that gives their body the ability to kind of compensate and move around. When it comes to levers and fulcrums, how do you find the effective fulcrum when you're applying a lever? Like with arm bars and knee bars, it's obvious, right? If you're trying to go for like an arm bar, it's pretty obvious that the fulcrum is the elbow. Or for a knee bar, it's pretty obvious that the fulcrum is the kneecap. But like, how does this line up in practice? How do you know where the fulcrum is when you're trying to control someone's lever?
Well, basically, like if you think about an arm bar, when you go for the arm bar, and again, this is all Professor Rob. I mean, this guy's unreal. When you go for an arm bar on somebody, look at the hitchhiker escape, for example. Probably the most fundamental escape you're going to learn in jiu-jitsu. Now, I don't even like this escape anymore. Mm-hmm. I think that this is actually a really poor way to escape the arm bar because it's so easy to stop. And obviously over voice recording, it's difficult to explain. But let's say you're in an arm bar. The fulcrum, what I need to create a fulcrum in my opponent's elbow. Now, let's say I'm holding my partner's arm and I'm pulling it down. What you're going to notice is naturally your opponent, if they're trying to hitchhike and turn away, what they're doing is raising their shoulder. So when your opponent raises the shoulder, the pressure from the elbow, you're trying to apply pressure into the elbow, it will bleed into the shoulder. And as a result, that it will act as a cushion, sort of a shock that will absorb the pressure, and you will not be able to isolate pressure inside the elbow joint. So I know that I want to hyperextend his elbow. But if I don't have the proper wedging system on his shoulder, he will be able to possibly hitchhiker. But if he just even turns away, you'll notice that his shoulder elevates. Mm-hmm. So it's very important that if I want to apply some sort of break, in this case, an armbar, a linear joint submission where I want to apply pressure into the elbow, I need to have control of the end of the lever, and I need to have control of the other end of the lever, which is the shoulder. And by control on the other end of the lever, I mean immobilization through way of my legs being wedges. So if I can immobilize that shoulder so that it cannot raise, now the pressure inside the mounting in the elbow will have nowhere to go, and I'll get either a tap or a broken arm.
Yeah, makes sense.
So really, I mean, same thing in terms of a knee bar, or even like, for some people that know or are comfortable with the 411, I need to create a wedging system on the hip and behind the knee in order to prevent my partner from spinning out of my 411. If you're doing the 411 and you have the free leg, which is, something some people might not know about, but like, let's say I'm in the 411, I have the free leg control with my arms. If I'm losing my partner's knee, it's because my wedging system is not strong enough and I don't have the proper control on my opponent's hip or behind his knee, depending on how he's escaping. So, I mean, generally, if you're going for submissions and you feel like everything is in place, but your opponent keeps escaping and consistently escaping, you're probably going to want to go back and ask, first of all, how they're escaping and what you can do to make that a little bit more difficult for them to escape. And that's applying the proper wedges so that you've isolated the lever and fulcrum.
Yeah, and we can actually talk about this in a little bit more detail later, but whenever you are losing a position or you're not getting the effectiveness in a move that you're expecting or wanting to get, the first three things you should ask yourself really are, have I established effective frames, if applicable? Do I have effective lever control? And am I wedging where I need to wedge? And that's a really good way to troubleshoot any particular move. This is maybe a good transition to talk about wedges then. So this is kind of the other of the three big mechanics that I know you talk about. So frames basically are using strong parts of your body, like your elbows, to essentially create obstructions to block your opponent. Levers are latching onto your opponent and grabbing onto something that you can then manipulate by torquing. What's a wedge?
So a wedge, the concept of a wedge is just something that you will use on your opponent to immobilize a portion of their body. Okay. You could look at a wedge as, you have an omoplata on someone. You could throw your leg over their shoulder and have the omoplata. But if you don't have the proper wedging system going on that shoulder, they will possibly be able to posture up and rip their arm out. Okay. So, Rob has something called position versus alignment. Okay. So like I could have an omoplata on someone. Aesthetically, it looks like an omoplata, but it's actually, I haven't broke their alignment, right? Now, if I decide that instead of just throwing my leg over my opponent's head, I'm going to pinch my knee down behind their shoulder, it creates an incredibly powerful wedge that pretty much stops at the end, stops at their shoulder and makes it very difficult for them to posture up. Then I throw my leg over as sort of a secondary thought to the wedge behind the shoulder because I want to immobilize that shoulder and I want to prevent my opponent from bringing their elbow back into their body. Right? In this case, I'm just creating a wedge by occupying the space in their armpit with my own body. In this case, it would be my thigh. Right? Or if I'm just think about a basic guard pass, when I'm passing someone's guard, one thing we didn't talk about in terms of frames, another great example of frames is connecting two levers together. So like a knee elbow connection,
kinetic chains, right?
Kinetic chain, but the passing of a guard is essentially creating a wedge in between the knee and elbow. So in the space between your opponent's belt and their armpit, if you can occupy that space with an arm or your body or even like a leg or a knee, you're going to essentially be in a position where you have passed their guard. And once you have passed their guard, people always ask me, how do I stay heavy? How do I be heavy on top? Well, I find it's actually less, being heavy is an important aspect, of course, being proper base and having proper weight distribution, but being able to manage wedges and place wedges effectively around your opponent's body where there's spaces is a really important concept in terms of holding top position. And not only will that help you hold top position and transition, but it'll help you isolate limbs better. Because once you create a wedge, let's say I'm in side control now on my partner, and I slip my arm underneath the far arm, as if I'm going for like just clasping my hands, or even in the opposite way, like a kimura, bringing my other arm over top and underneath their arm. I've created a wedge under that arm, effectively isolating it.
Got it. So most of the examples you've talked about so far pertaining to wedges are in the context of I'm setting up parts of my body to basically block my opponent's movement, right? Like I'm putting my elbow or my knee or my head somewhere. I'm taking away space so that my opponent can't go there. But you can also use a wedge offensively, right? Like, would it be the case that when you're doing knee on belly, like the knee is effectively like a wedge right into the gut? You're using it as a weapon?
Absolutely. Your knee and your shin, or if you want to use knee on belly as an example, or like essentially a shin ride, your shin and your leg is a wedge now. That is now past your opponent's guard, and it's preventing them from regarding. Right. And then, of course, how you're going to transition from there is going to depend on how your opponent regards. I didn't start learning about wedges until Professor Rob went and trained with Eddie Cummings, who at that time was training at Renzo Gracie's in New York. He went there to learn some leg lock stuff. He did a week of privates with him. He came back with some really primitive fundamental concepts for leg locking. And the main one was the idea of creating wedges around your opponent's limbs. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, from there, Professor Rob, he's a friggin' autistic genius. So he just went and took that and obsessed over it. And him and Rory essentially kept working at this. Rob and Rory are really the true creators of the Island Top Team leg lock system. But the idea of wedging and immobilizing was one of the key parts of leg locking and even just jiu-jitsu that I didn't even think really existed. Things that I already did, like, when you're in side control and you get a cross face, you're creating a wedge under your opponent's head, essentially, right? And having your knees close to your opponent's body, that's a wedge because you're immobilizing the movement of their hips. Granted, there's an elbow on the other side. So when he started teaching in terms of wedges, when we're doing leg locks, I realized, hey, this totally applies to all the submissions that I already do, like arm bars. If you try and do an arm bar and your legs are just doing, they're just limp noodles, you're not going to get any braking power. And as we discussed earlier, that's because you've allowed the pressure to flow into the shoulder.
Yeah.
Once the shoulder becomes mobile, you lose all the pressure of the armbar. So understanding proper wedging systems, in this case with your legs, is going to make your armbar so much more efficient, and it's going to prevent your opponent from escaping.
Yeah, the human being is a very, very adaptable machine, right? If someone is standing up and you push them, the body will instinctively rebalance itself, right? And the human being is very good at adapting to pressure and absorbing and redistributing pressure. And one of the big benefits to wedges is they take away that option, right? Because by completely restricting your opponent's movement, you now have control over where the force goes. The other big benefit to wedges is that wedges take away options from your opponent. If you have wedged your opponent in 100 different ways, then you've taken away options as to where they can go and what they can do. And jiu-jitsu gets a lot easier when you know that your opponent has fewer options because you know what to prepare for. An example I can think of, I remember when I was sparring with my professor, this is kind of one of the times when wedging really came home to me, at least when using wedges as an offensive weapon. My professor, Don Whitefield, I was sparring with him, and man, I realized, it just felt like all I was doing was getting just connecting with elbows and knees. That was it. I could never get a grip on the end on his hand or on his leg or on his head. It was just elbows and knees coming at me. There was nothing else. And that's when I kind of realized it's because he's basically creating these strong, unexploitable wedges. He's not wrapping his hand around me. He's leading with the parts of the body that are very, very hard to exploit. He's basically using frames and wedges as a weapon against me. This is something that I tell to I tell to my wife when we're training, because she's trains too, but not with the same experience that I have. I always just tell her, just use your pointies, right? If you want to defend yourself, one of the first things that you want to do, especially against a bigger, stronger guy, is use your elbows and your knees as weapons. Don't push with your hands. Frame and use your elbows, because that's a much stronger structure and is much, much harder to counter, even if you're a big, strong person. So we've got three core concepts that we've talked about here when it comes to the mechanics of jiu-jitsu. We've talked about frames, levers, and wedges. Are there any others, Matt, that you think are worth bringing into it? Or are those kind of the big three that make up almost everything?
I mean, those are kind of the main mechanisms that fundamentally I can teach jiu-jitsu with. But of course, there's going to be other things such as hooks and clamps, right? A hook, you got to realize all these things, frames, levers, wedges, they're all things that exist in the real world, but that we replicate in jiu-jitsu with our body parts, right? So a hook or a clamp, a hook is going to be used to elevate an opponent, usually, like a butterfly hook, or even like a De La Riva hook, right? This is where you're using You're
making a connection, basically.
You're making a connection with the shoelaces or your instep of your foot around a portion of your opponent's body, right? And they can serve different purposes, but most of the time, a hook is going to be to elevate. A clamp, generally the best example I think about of a clamp is going to be you're in half guard, you cross your ankles, or maybe you're in closed guard, you cross your ankles. Maybe you're in 411, you cross your ankles. It's important to think about a clamp as it's almost like a wedge in that it can immobilize, but you're by crossing your ankles in these certain positions, you're going to create, again, another kinetic chain inside of your legs. Once you essentially create a circle closing your ankles together, it really gives you a lot of strong braking power, and this is very, very very a big part of our Island Top Team leg lock system, especially when we're looking to get braking mechanics.
Got it. So really what you're describing to me when you're talking about hooks and clamps, these are in a lot of ways no different from what we talked about earlier. A hook and a clamp, these are really just ways to establish levers, right? That's all it is. If I have a De La Riva hook on you, that's just a lever. It's just a particular way of doing it.
Exactly.
Got it. So really everything kind of funnels into those three big core mechanics. And I think then when you're struggling with a move, or even if a move is effective and you just want to make it more effective, really one of the questions to ask yourself is, how effectively am I utilizing these mechanics? Do I, could I be framing better? This is especially important in defensive situations. Can I establish lever control? Can I have better control over the lever? And with wedges, can I take away my opponent's options by restricting movement using wedges, or even can I lead with a wedge and use it as a weapon?
And for instructors listening out there, it's really important to. The reason that I started, when Rob was talking about these types of mechanisms and all this scientific language, at first I didn't know what to think of it. I was like, hey, well, this is like I'm doing pretty good at jiu-jitsu so far. Maybe I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing. But then I realized once I started programming my mind to see not a person fighting me, but a skeleton essentially with frames with levers, and I'm able to exploit them with wedges. And I was applying this language to my my everyday sparring scenarios. Not only did it break it down so much easier for me to understand, but for me to relay this information to my teammates and my students, it became so much more easy. Because when I say, a lever, everyone knows what I'm talking about. When I say, when I describe how I'm doing an arm bar and I say I'm creating a series of wedges around the shoulder, that language parallels throughout all of jiu-jitsu. So it's very beneficial, I found, for instructors when they're trying to say exactly why they're doing something and why something works. It's very important to understand frames, levers, wedges, posture, structure base, all of the alignment stuff that we're talking about.
Got it. Yeah. So in terms of how these things all fit together, how these are the core mechanics of jiu-jitsu, but how do they tie into the alignment stuff we talked about before? I mean, if I could give maybe an example, and again, Matt, you can help correct me if I'm wrong on this. Let's say that I'm going for like a knee bar on somebody, right? Really what as per what we talked about on the last episode, if I want to effectively control someone and ultimately submit them, I need to have posture, structure, and base, and I need to deny that to my opponent. So, common problem with the knee bar. And I bring up the knee bar because the leg is such a strong part of the body. I mean, it is very hard to just get a straight knee bar or if you're just pulling back on the guy's leg. So one of the core things that people always tell you with the knee bar is, you want to twist his knee as well. You don't want to just pull straight back. So how does that tie into this? The reason, from my mind, the leg is ultimately the lever, right? When you have control over that leg, you're grabbing that lever, and you are also, when you pinch into your opponent, and you're basically creating wedges to prevent him from extracting that leg. And when you add that rotational control to the leg, so you kind of, you grab the heel and you twist it a bit.
Like a heel hook almost.
Almost like a heel hook. The reason you do that is because you're breaking his structure, right? The leg is a very, very powerful, solid structure. But when you twist that leg out of alignment, it breaks the structure, and that effectively kills his alignment. Because if you try to just do a straight knee bar where you're just pulling back, you haven't really broken his alignment yet, and there's still a chance that it might not work. But that twist takes away the structure, right?
Definitely the twist is going to apply more pressure, but I would say that breaking the structure essentially happens when you've got to unlock the leg, right? And
that's the main part. If the guy's got his legs crossed, then he has ultimate structure there, right?
But here's the thing. When the guy crosses his legs, you have the leg that you're attacking is in between your legs, right? Mm-hmm. We can all visualize a knee bar. If you can control the free leg, which is the other leg, the unentangled leg, you are going to have both levers of your partner's hip controlled, which is going to, they might be able to roll around a little bit, but it is going to heavily immobilize them. So breaking their structure, once you get control of these levers and you have the ends of their levers combined with proper wedging, that is going to be the true breaking of structure. The twisting, I think, is just a nice detail to add to the finishing mechanics themselves. Like, sometimes you're in an arm bar and to get, you want to control the thumb, right? So you dictate which way the elbow points. That is going to make you're going to know exactly where your fulcrum point needs to be. In this case, we're discussing essentially turning a knee bar into kind of a hidden heel hook, which is an awesome detail. Back to wedges. If I have my partner in a knee bar, we tend to think that I want to I'm going to grab the end of their leg and I'm going to lean back, right? Like if you've ever seen Boss Rudin show a knee bar, that like 20-year-old instructional, he's extending his body all the way back. Okay. We call this follow through room. Mm-hmm. The key here is not actually extending your hips all the way back, even though it looks deadly. Just keep in mind, this is exactly the same concept as the armbar. So if I do that, but my legs are not effectively wedging and immobilizing my opponent's hips,
the pressure bleeds.
The pressure bleeds. My opponent will have mobility. They will be able to absorb and move around. When I do knee bars, it's not so much how obviously you need to extend the leg. That has to happen. But just like the armbar, it's not so much about your follow through room. It's more about your ability to immobilize their hip. Once you immobilize their hip, the follow through room, you don't even need a lot of follow through room. It's more about, in this case, you cross your ankles, creating a closed circuit or a closed wedge, or essentially you're clamping around their leg. And then you're pulling your heels into your butt. So when your ankles are crossed, your hip pressure is going to be enormous. Not so much about leaning back, but more about how your wedges are pulling, essentially you're pulling your heels to your butt, applying more pressure with your hips, locking down their hip.
What's funny is you and I were talking about something similar to this right before we started recording. And that's that, we both realized that, if you want to attack an armbar, really a lot of the time, the secret to attacking an armbar is not pulling on the arm that you've got. It's controlling the arm on the other side or the shoulder on the other side. And this all kind of comes back to the fact that the human body is really good at redistributing pressure to prevent discomfort, right? If for the longest time when I tried to armbar somebody, I thought I had it all perfect, but I would go to pull on their arm and there'd be just too much space and they'd retract their elbow and then I'm on bottom. And I realized quite recently that really the big problem is I was focusing too much on controlling the near arm, but controlling just the near arm is not enough because the human body can still move. He's still got a lot of movement if his far arm and the rest of his body can do whatever he wants. It's about establishing wedges around the far arm. So I have the near arm as a lever, and then I use my feet or even my hands sometimes to wedge his far shoulder so that he actually can't move that either. And it's similar with a lot of leg entanglements, like you said, where it's like, yeah, you can have your body all wrapped around one leg in standard Ashi or in any other position like that, but the guy's ability to get out and scramble out and move is greatly enhanced if you're not controlling that far leg as well.
Yeah, and we were comparing arm bars to the 411, right? Like anyone out there who plays 411, you're in that position, the inside Senkaku, your legs are triangled or wedging around the leg you want to heel hook. If you just focus on heel hooking that leg, and the free leg has the ability to get into base, right? They're building alignment by putting that foot in a base, turning away. All of a sudden, the heel hook that was there is gone because your opponent turns their foot out and that hides the heel. So you can't expose the heel. This is such a big problem with the heel hook against really good opponents. Against people that don't know leg locks, you're going to heel hook them every time, okay? Because still leg locks are becoming more powerful, but because of the fear mongering of the IBJJF and certain individuals, you're not going to have a deep understanding from even a lot of high level grapplers. However, going to the heel hook, your legs are essentially creating wedges around the leg that you plan on attacking with the heel hook, and your hands are controlling the free leg. There you're going to have what Dan Herr calls double trouble, but essentially two levers to your opponent's hips. That's going to prevent them from turning away, and it's also going to keep the heel hook available because they can't they can't hide their heel anymore. So it's the same thing for an armbar, like you're saying. When your legs are essentially wedging around the arm that you want, and you're keeping obviously you have to keep the elbow line, and then your hands are going to focus on, not only controlling that arm, but trying to control the far lever as well. Once you do that, your opponent is essentially in a straight jacket position, and it's going to leave them with very little ability to roll out and move out. So it's, all of these concepts tie into control rather than how to finish a submission, right? Mm-hmm. Finishing the submission is a byproduct of control. So one of the big things that I got from Professor Rob is how can we use control to lead to a submission rather than thinking about how can I make my game so submission heavy, I want to be such a submission artist. Yeah, well, you can't do that without control. If you are doing that, you're probably creating some false positives in your school because there's people that don't know how to defend. And that's a real problem too that maybe we could discuss on another day.
I was actually just teaching this afternoon. In class, we were working on side control. So, and the thing I explained was that, whenever someone teaches side control, usually they start with some submission and they say, oh, here's how you do an Americana from side control. But my advice to the team was, don't even think about submissions. Don't get into side control and think, it's Kimura time. I'm going to do a Kimura from here. The submission is irrelevant. What you need to focus on is systematically breaking and dismantling your opponent and taking away his weapons one by one. If you're in side control and your opponent has framed properly and you can't get your arm under his head, it doesn't matter what submission you want to do. It ain't going to happen, right? The guy's going to get out of there as soon as you start making space. What you need to do is you need to isolate his limbs. You want to isolate his head. You want to isolate his arms. And you want to crank up the pressure. Just repeat. You want to start isolating, taking away his ability to move and his ability to generate force. And eventually you get to the point where submissions are almost inevitable, right? I mean, if you're relatively experienced and you're sparring against like a high level guy, you'll notice this. When I'm sparring against someone way better than me, it's not like they just jump on me and Kimura me and it's done. It's not like a flash submission. What winds up happening is the position just gets progressively shittier for me over and over, pardon the language, but just progressively worse. It starts off and then suddenly my arm is trapped and then my other arm is trapped and now I can't move my head and I know what they're going to do and then they do it and I can't stop them because every part of my body is controlled. And that's really the way that you should be thinking about jiu-jitsu. The submission should not be your focus. The focus should be on turning up the dial on control to the point where a submission just kind of happens because there's nothing else for your opponent to do. On that topic too, as it pertains to side control, the thing about side control that people often do incorrectly at a junior level is they kind of lie on the person like a heavy blanket. And they feel like, oh, this is what side control is about. Side control is about weight and pressure. Yeah. And man, if you've ever sparred with someone who's way bigger than you, you certainly can tell that in some situations this works, right? I mean,
or even in no-gi, where there's no grips or anything like that.
I mean, weight matters in side control, but side control, the power of side control is actually mobility and being able to generate strong pinpoint force. The thing that I taught today was, if you got side control on a person, rather than trying to lie on them like a blanket, think of wedges, right? A wedge is all about leading with, basically minimizing the surface area of where you're putting down force. So the example I gave was, hey, rather than just sitting on the guy, do the shoulder of justice. Turn to the side, put all your weight on your shoulder and drive it into the guy's jaw to turn it away from him.
Which is essentially, sorry to interrupt, accessing his jaw as a lever to his spine.
Yeah, it's accessing the jaw, is using the head as a lever. It's breaking his posture because you're turning his head away, and you're using your shoulder as a wedge because rather than lying on the guy, you are dropping all of your weight down onto a single point of your body. And if you recall from just basic physics, if you can minimize the surface area of where you're putting your force, is going to be a lot more powerful. If rather than just flopping on the guy like a blanket, if I'm putting all of my pressure into a single pinpoint area of my body, like I'm using my shoulder and all my weight's going through my shoulder or through a knee or something, it's going to be a lot harder for the guy on the bottom to get out of that. This is something that I think is effective as a troubleshooting technique. When you want to learn why your moves aren't working, or if you have a move that is working and you just want it to be better, ask yourself, when it comes to the core mechanics, how are my levers? Am I properly controlling levers? In addition to the levers, have I wedged my opponent in such a way that this lever control is actually effective? If you've just got if you arm bar and you just have control over the arm and you're not pinning the far shoulders, you have an opportunity to use wedges there to really pin the guy in position, right?
Exactly. And yeah, the way that I think about it is, activating the lever, not necessarily just like, if I'm playing, say I'm playing bottom open guard or seated guard, and I grab my opponent's wrist, if he recoils and is able to pull his wrist right back, I may have grabbed his wrist, his lever, but did I activate it?
Yeah.
There's more efficient ways that you can always, quote, activate levers. So, for example, if I can gain some internal rotation with a 2-on-1 on my opponent's wrist, I'm therefore going to have rotational control of his shoulder, which makes it a little bit more difficult for him to dictate which way he's going to face me. So I can now enter in for leg entanglements, or I can just prevent him from passing my guard.
And another way to really make levers more powerful is to establish a wedge on the far side. I mean, we talked about this in the context of arm bars and leg entanglements, but I mean, just today, Matt, when you and I were sparring, you arm dragged me and then you put your head up against my shoulder on the backside, using it as a wedge. So you had my arm as a lever, and then you had a wedge behind me so I couldn't extract that lever, which sucked for me.
And as a result, you couldn't extract that arm. You could not square up to me.
Exactly.
Therefore, I had rotational, for a moment there I had rotational control of your body, but that's how I'm going to be able to get to the back position, by keeping my head as a wedge behind your shoulder and preventing you from squaring up to me again.
Yeah.
I should also mention that earlier when we were talking about framing, it's very important that when you're framing that you're in base as well. So depending on, there's infinite scenarios that we could be talking about, but I need to be in base when I'm framing. And generally I'm in base, if someone's passing my guard and my hips are turned the other way, right? So maybe my opponent grabbed my leg and leg dragged me. They're using the lever to my hip to redirect my hips facing away. Once my hips are facing away, it's very difficult for me to now frame up successfully, because where my hips go, my spine wants to go. Yeah. So I end up trying to frame the other way with my hands. I'm going to be twisting my own spine and breaking my own posture.
Your posture and your base, to some degree, have been nullified at that point.
Exactly. So when I'm framing, I would like to have my feet in base, or, ideally my back in base, or my shoulders. It all depends on the situation. But just know that if I am trying to create a strong frame, and especially when I'm regarding, I will need to get in base to get mobile and to be able to also apply a frame that's successful, right?
Yeah.
If I don't have base, then I don't have that platform that I can apply the force in whatever direction I desire relative to my goal. The
simplest way that I can think about it is that a frame is used as a distance controlling mechanism, right? If you don't have base is about movement. If you don't have base, you really can't move, and you can't move to respond to your opponent's movement. If you have a frame, but you don't have base, you can't move. And if you can't move, there's nothing stopping your opponent from just walking right around your frame. They don't have to deal with your frame, right? A common example here is like if you're trying to pass someone's guard and they knee shield. Well, you can just, to some extent, you can just back out and walk around the knee shield, right? You never try to go through a frame directly. So that's the reason why having base on the bottom is so important. You have to be able to respond to your opponent's movement as well as just dealing with the frame itself.
Exactly. Or for the example, if someone does like a bullfighter pass, a Toriano, and then they get to, they put their foot next to your hip and you're framing with your hands. So yes, you've created pretty successful frames with your hands, but your opponent has created a wedge next to your hip. So technically he's past your guard. We're in the recovery phase of guard, as we discussed last time, the third phase, right? He's about to get points essentially for this position. The common thing that beginners do is they try and throw their feet right over top, but nothing happens because you do not have the correct distance needed to get your feet back inside. Now, if you get your guard pass there and you put your feet in base, it's counterintuitive to put your feet on the ground when you want to have your feet in front of your opponent. But putting your feet on the ground is going to allow you to get your hips mobile. You can do a successful hip escape. And now we can circle our outside foot on top. We can top step and create a really strong frame with the sole of our foot. So being in base is going to give you the mobility needed to manage distance and replace frames.
Yeah, so you're saying basically, rather than trying to do the quote-unquote throw the leg over guard recovery, rather than just thinking about the technique. You're saying, forget the technique, focus on having proper alignment, focus on keeping, on framing effectively, on having base. And then from there, if you do that, good things will eventually happen. It doesn't really matter what guard recovery technique you use, as long as you're safe the whole way through and eventually you do recover. You don't need to necessarily focus on one technique bullet point, right?
That's right, yeah. And everything just comes back to managing the distance, whatever kind of a guard you prefer. Just make sure that you have posture, structure, base, you have proper frames, and you're not getting your guard pass. Like if you're in half guard, make sure your opponent's not flattening you out, unless you're a huge lockdown player, which there are those out there.
I'm somewhat partial to it. I mean, I understand it has a lot of weaknesses, mostly centered around what it does to your own base. Because you're basically forcing the guy to sit on top of you, and that has limitations. But there's a time and a place for it.
There is a time and a place for it. I use it only in dire circumstances, generally.
Yeah. It's like my plan B.
And I don't mean to shit on anyone. Like the lockdown it can be quite a formidable tool for those that are really good at it. There's a ton of great submissions that you can get at, like electric chair and all that stuff. But when you're in half guard, generally you want to be on your side, right? So it's hard to do the lockdown when you're on your side. Like generally, I find it when I'm on my back flat, and when I'm on my back flat, my shoulders and my hips are facing the ceiling. My opponent's force vector is coming down on me from the side, so I haven't matched his force vector with the angle of my hips. So I consider that being a bit out of alignment. Generally speaking, in the half guard, you always want to be on your side. So just think about that as well when you're recovering guard. Let's say you're playing the half guard. The angle of your hips and, of course, your ability to manage frames and be in base is really important.
Yeah. Lockdown is a move that I'm somewhat partial to it. But like you said, I use it as a plan B. It's not where I want to go, but sometimes your opponent puts you there. And the thing about lockdown that you have to bear in mind is, because you are basically on your butt, and because your opponent is on top of you, number one, it's really hard to effectively generate base from there as the guy on the bottom, because your legs are entangled around the other guy's leg. And while that's the case, you can't really use your feet to generate force. The other thing to bear in mind is, because your opponent is directly on top of you, they can wrap their arm around your head. They can create pressure that way, which breaks your posture. So you got to be ready for that. Like if you go to lockdown and you let the guy put his arm around you and squish your head, that can be a real problem for you. But if you can control that, you can really, that control you have over the leg when you're entangled around it, that lever control, it can be ultra effective. I've used it to great success in the past, but it wouldn't be my preferred way of dealing with half guard, simply because there are other options in half guard where I don't need to compromise my base and my posture like that.
Yeah, if you're a big player of half guard, you like things like lockdown and reverse Talahiva, you gotta be concerned about your opponent cross facing you, because once it's
an immediate posture killer. Basically.
It's an immediate posture killer, and it can also lead to neck problems down the road. Right, you got to protect your necks, right? So you don't want to be eating cross faces and basing a game around always being in the cross face. That's not a wise thing to do if jiu-jitsu is something you want to do into your later years.
And side note, if like me, you work in an office, eventually you get tired of explaining to people why you look like a victim of domestic abuse when you go into the office. So learning to block the crossface becomes very, very important in that situation.
Yeah, and it's interesting how you mentioned the lockdown. You're not able to get your feet in base because they are being used to apply a clamp around your opponent's leg. But in situations like the lockdown and deep half guard, for example, this same sort of thing. Deep half guard, your legs are usually either clamped around your opponent's leg as you're underneath their hips, or maybe you're creating a butterfly hook to elevate that leg. Either way, if a different type of lever control here, you don't have the ability to put your feet in base for these positions, but what you can do is you can swing their leg out like a hand on a clock, which is essentially going to dictate where their hips go. Yeah. So if you're an effective deep half guard player, and, granted, you're doing the right things with your arms and staying in alignment with your spine, your posture, you'll be able to swing your opponent's leg, and maybe you'll end up on the back, or maybe you can come out through the on top through, the classic deep half guard sweep. So again, just another form of lever control where you are using a lever to shift your opponent's center of gravity and creating openings for you.
Yeah, so that's a situation where you've made an intentional trade. You've said, I may have compromised my base, but I've also taken your base away. So now it's going to come down to posture and structure, right? If we were to use the scorecard game that we talked about earlier, when you're talking about things like lockdown, for example, or even deep half, the guy on the bottom, you have to be very concerned about losing your posture if you get cross-faced. Your base is going to be very compromised, but so is the guy on top.
Yeah.
So it ultimately, I find in a lot of cases, comes down to a structure battle. It comes down to, is the other guy able to control my arms? Am I able to control his? What can I do with this leg that I've got entangled, right?
Yeah. And you should learn the crab ride.
You should definitely
check out my DVD coming out this
year.
year.
Where can you learn the crab ride?
Yeah, I got a DVD coming out on the Berimbolo and the crab ride. It's got some really good stuff. It's with Stefan Kesting and Rob Bernacki, of course, really took a lot of his time to help me prepare and design this DVD so that it's going to be as best as it can be. And, we went through a lot of hoops. We did beta filming and a lot of stuff to make sure that this is going to be some really good material. So to add that upside down part of your game, like for instance, I just say that because when I think about exiting the deep half, a lot of time I end up upside down, and it's a great option rather than just some old school deep half finishes. So Crab Ride DVD, definitely check it out.
Yeah, it's a good option for everyone to have. And the reason why, I'm someone who is not super fluent in the world of the upside down, but the way that I like to describe it is, Jiu-Jitsu is mostly a game of advancing through predefined, it's not really, but people think of it as a way of advancing through like the positional hierarchy. You go from, standing to guard to passing to mount or back. There's kind of this road that you follow. The cool thing about inversions and crab rides is it's like a teleporter to another dimension. Like rather than going down that road, you can skip right to the back if you know how to do it effectively while maintaining control the whole time and not putting yourself at risk. Now, granted, that's where most people go wrong, is they don't have control and they put themselves at risk. And hopefully that's what your DVD is going to be able to address for the people out there.
Yeah, I just want to introduce that type of a game to to as many people as I can. Of course, the younger generation is going to probably already be using this stuff because, it's very common in high level jiu-jitsu now. So it's definitely something that you will see. But if you don't know how to defend it at all, you're going to be in trouble. So definitely check that out and, add it to your game. It's a really great option. I use it all the time. It is really effective, and it's going to have a lot of great things that you can do with your training partners to become better at inversions, berimbolos, and just have an idea of what you're doing when you're going upside down there.
Yeah,
so that's my shameless plug.
And as always, if you want to see our detailed database of the mental models that we've documented, go to bjjmentalmodels.com. That's our home website. It's also where there's a link to the podcast. Matt, just to do a quick recap then of what we talked about today. In the first episode, we talked about alignment. Basically, that means posture, structure, and base. Today, we talked about the core mechanics of jiu-jitsu, which basically means how do you get alignment in practice, and how do you take it away from your opponent? The main mechanisms are going to be levers, which basically means, grabbing and isolating and controlling one of the things sticking off of your opponent's body. So his legs, his arms, or his neck. Levers being number one. Frames as well. Frames meaning creating strong obstacles with your body to prevent your opponent's movement and to control the distance. And then wedges, meaning basically to take away space around your opponent so that they have fewer options, they can't move. Wedges can also be used offensively, as in the case of knee on belly or the shoulder of justice from side control.
Or joint locks, as we were discussing, 411 and arm bars and all that stuff.
Got it. Cool. I think that's all for today. Thank you so much, Matt.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Steve.
Take care, guys.
Enjoyed.